Well, first of all, welcome to the Debs Center, named after a great man who promoted many women, Richard Debs, who passed away recently. He was the board chair during one of AUB's critical periods after the Reformation of the university following the Civil War. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today for this signal event that's hosted by the Global Engagement Center and the Asfari Institute, and it's very fitting that it's about gender equality initiatives and the elevation of women, women's rights, women's issues on a global scale, and talking about what universities can do. Relatively briefly, I'm going to say that the university's been undergoing a significant journey with regard to women's issues, empowerment of women on many levels. So I think the most obviously successful has been with regard to women's leadership. On our main campus, we went from 8 or 9% women leadership in the high touch positions to 45%. We're not there yet, good progress in 8 years. Under the guidance of Dr. Fadlo R, who's here today, we have tremendous awareness of women's sexual health issues, which is a topic that is not discussed appropriately or adequately in many parts of the world. I can say, as a physician, this really is an issue. We have, I would argue, the most robust Title IX program, I think, in the region, where people are held accountable for their behaviors with regard to power dynamics, and I think it's fair to say the faculty, staff, and students get it. But that's probably not enough, because I can see that in some countries, they think the solution is to have a minister for women's affairs. Well, women are 50-something% of the population, and that seems like a little bit of an anachronism. And Lebanon still has only, what, Lina, 5 women? 5 or 6?
Parliamentarians, 6.
6. And
out of 128.
128 people, mostly doing very little to advance the cause of Lebanon. So only 6 women can be blamed. But only 1 woman minister right now and 24 members. So very embarrassing, okay, and very inappropriate. But it's about much more than the number of women. It's about bringing forth the issues that help us progress as a society. For us, I think it's critical that we grasp these issues and the role of the university at a time when we can make a difference. And why do I say that? Well, being completely undiplomatic, I'll leave that to you ladies. In the 1990s, in America at least, the university endowments grew to a degree that most universities made the decision to bring in people who would manage the donors, keep them happy, but not deal with some of the core issues for academia. And the core issues of academia are more complex than diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those are important issues, but you've seen a backlash against them now from people who want to prevent equality. But the core issues of academia center around a voyage of self-discovery for the students and self-realization, self-fulfillment that has been denied for women in most parts of the world until recently. The result has been an attack on the academies in the West, from which I think they're starting to think their way out of it. I'm not loud enough, okay? That's a good thing. But how are they starting to think their way out of it? I think through allowing space, although that's not necessarily true right now at US universities and German universities, for activism, allowing space for people to express very different ideas. And if you look at the history of universities coming to grips with new ideas, challenging dogma, that has been about the least privileged folks in the relationship, be it minorities, African Americans in the US, women, demanding a voice in the evolution of academic institutions and other institutions. And I'm happy to say that at AUB at least we have a very strong sense, and lots of credit to Lina, about the intersection of academia and activism. It's something we have to be careful about, because you're seeing even some of the universities most famous for activism, including in the city, quieting it down so that there can be a consensus. Look, I love consensus as much as the next person, but consensus should be arrived at by allowing people to express themselves fully. And for that, we're very grateful that at the American University of Beirut, we have a number of strong women leaders who are unafraid to challenge dogma. And so that's what I hope you'll all do today. I hope you will feel free to challenge convention, to challenge dogma. Societies are defined by their willingness to not accept good enough or what is told to them as the way things are in order to realize real progress. And for that, we're grateful for your presence, and I thank you. I apologize if I've gone on too long and too softly.
Thank you, President Khuri, and again, welcome everybody. I will be your moderator today. I'm Lina Abou Habib, and I'm the director of the Asfari Institute at the American University of Beirut, and I want to recognize and acknowledge the immense work that was done in the conceptualization and in the preparation of this event. So thank you, Dr. Tanya Haddad, the director of the Global Engagement Initiative, and my wonderful colleague Carla Ail, and also our wonderful colleague Dr. Faisal Qaq. Getting us here took a lot of conversations and discussions, but I want to say that that's part of an initiative that we started at AUB, looking at tools that are likely to be appropriated by social movements in promoting gender equality, essentially foreign feminist policies. On March 8th, as every year, we celebrated International Women's Rights Day at AUB, and it was in collaboration with our friends from the government of Mexico and Chile and Brazil, around feminist foreign policies, as again, not in terms of just saying this is going to resolve all the problems, but how can they resolve all the problems, and what are the gaps that we are seeing, particularly against a background of increasing conflict, increasing economic disparities, increasing oppression and abuses. And I'm hoping that this is a conversation that we're continuing today with our 6 wonderful speakers. And I want to start with Minister Grahn-Laasonen. Am I getting it right now?
Very well.
Minister Laasonen has an amazing track record as a politician, and also as somebody who has championed gender equality. And I was talking with your ambassador in Lebanon, Anne Miskanen, and she was saying, maybe Finland doesn't have a foreign feminist policy as such. It has been branded by Sweden,
Yes.
and we're getting to Åsa, but actually Finland practices, at least domestically. And so I wanted to talk to you as representing a country that doesn't have, until now, something specific called foreign feminist policy, but who has done quite a lot in terms of promoting pro-equality policies. So would you share with us your experiences on advancing gender equality through a process that may not be branded now as Anne says, but which looks very much like a feminist foreign policy? Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for an excellent question as well. Finland might not call it, like, in everyday life, a feminist foreign policy, but Finland, of course, and all the Nordic countries are very feminist in our very basic values. And we also lead by example. For example, Finnish women have had very meaningful leadership role in Finnish politics already decades. At the moment, I'm in a government where we have 12 out of 19 government members that are women. So it's very much women-led policy we do. And we've had women holding the positions of head of state, foreign ministers, prime ministers. So long tradition of women leadership position. And also here in UN, I just came from a seminar held for celebrating Helvi Sipilä, the very first Assistant General Secretary of UN. It was women already in 70 something. So that's great. But maybe I would like to start by extending my sincere gratitude to American University of Beirut and to the Asfari Institute for Civil Society and Citizenship and Global Engagement Initiative for organizing this esteemed event. And I would also like to thank our co-sponsors and co-organizers, Mexico, UN Women and the NGO Commission of the CSW for being here today with us. We're working towards a common goal of eradicating poverty, and let us stay true to that commitment of leaving no one behind. The Southwest Asia and North African region has a young population with much potential. For a good sustainable future, we need financing for gender equality. For companies. To ensure financial development, we need to ensure mutual rights, adequate funding, and representation for all citizens of SWANA region. The rights of women and girls in all of their diversity and their participation in society are keys to a well-functioning democracy. The participation of women and girls in all areas of foreign and security policy and empowering them in decision-making leads to a more sustainable, prosperous and peaceful reality and future. In a world where these rights are constantly under attack, for example by the anti-gender movement, we must be relentless in our commitments to foster gender equality. Women and girls living in poverty experience multiple and compounding deprivations, including being denied a decent education, lower standard of living, worse food security and nutrition, lack of adequate housing and limited access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. Several other factors including race, ethnicity, disability, place of residence, marital and migrant status, HIV status, sexual orientation and gender identity are factors that unfortunately intensify inequality. Lack of access to decent work and economic resources is one of the main drivers of women's poverty. Labor markets often reproduce gender inequalities. Globally, just about 62% of women aged 25 to 54 were engaged in labor force in 2022, compared with more than 90% of men in the same age range. The gender gap in employment has persisted for 2 decades. Employment gaps, occupational segregation, and the higher likelihood of part-time employment increases the gendered income inequality. Women also deserve equal pay from work of equal value. Discrimination against women and girls means less potential fulfilled, less income, less well-being, and less security. No society can afford to overlook half of its population. To close the gap globally and in SWANA region requires gender-conscious budgeting and gender-conscious spending. It requires foreign policy with a gender-transformative approach. Finland, together with other Nordic countries, has excellent cooperation with the AUB and the Asfari Institute. Supported by the Nordic Council of Ministers, we are working on a project aimed at enhancing women's political and economic empowerment in Lebanon. The project is called Shifting Narratives Towards Economic and Political Empowerment of Women in Lebanon. Acknowledging the underrepresentation of women in these spheres, our mutual work is focused on targeted advocacy and to the identification of new political initiatives. We recognize the macroeconomic impact of gender equality, and we strive to address the low rates of women labor market participation and political representation in Lebanon. And I believe that through initiatives and foreign policy cooperation like this, we can find models to improve gender equality in the whole SWANA region. The promotion of women's and girls' rights and gender equality has been at the heart of the different dimensions of Finland's foreign policy for years. My country is focused in supporting sustainable development, and we are supporting the rights and representation of women and girls in all their diversity. Finland knows very well from its own history that a well-functioning democracy, the rule of law, human rights and a vibrant civil society are prerequisites and catalysts for social development. The priorities of my government's development policy includes improving the right to bodily autonomy and sexual and reproductive health and rights of women and girls. Actors like Asfari Institute for Civil Society and Citizenship and the AUB, who bring together a dynamic community of academics, practitioners and civil society actors with decision makers, can do and do make a difference. And dear friends, working for rights, funding and representation against the backdrop of rising anti-rights movements globally and in the SWANA region is not easy. And to succeed, we need political commitment and financing for gender equality. Let us leave no one behind. So thank you very much, and I very much look forward to discussion and learning also.
Thank you, Minister. And I noticed the use of the terminology SWANA as a decolonized term, and I want to acknowledge the intentionality in using it. So thank you very much. And again, it's been a learning process working with the Nordic Council of Ministers in co-creating together initiatives that are based on the lived experiences of women in a particularly difficult context of political and economic disenfranchisement. So I want to acknowledge also how important it has been, especially as we're moving forward with this initiative at a time when the context is getting even more and more difficult, hence the importance. So thank you so much. Ms. Alicia Buenrostro, she is the Deputy Permanent Representative of Mexico in the UN. And I want to just to say that AUB has been collaborating with Mexico for quite some time, particularly with Colegio de Mexico. So it has been an amazing collaboration, and we have begun this work on exploring and unpacking foreign feminist policy with the Mexican government. This is because, of course, from the Latin America part of the world, Mexico has been the first country to adopt a feminist foreign policy. I think Chile is the most recent one, if I'm not mistaken. So basically, you come with 4 years of experimenting, and we've had a really good conversation about what this has meant and what kind of learning you're bringing with you in experimenting with a foreign feminist policy, both domestically and globally. So over to you, Alicia.
Thank you very much, Lina. And first of all, I want to thank President Khuri and congratulate you for this venue, amazing venue of the American University of Beirut. Mexico has very strong links with the Lebanese community in Mexico. It's very active and a super nice community, I would say. I love everything from Lebanon, from food, to, it's
Normally our
fines, your
diaspora
beaches.
is embarrassing, so I hope I haven't done anything.
And your people, Lebanese people are just amazing. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. And yes, before starting, I would like to say that now I feel more comfortable talking about a feminist foreign policy. Because imagine, I don't like saying what something is when we don't have the real basis of what could a feminist foreign policy could be, or how should it be developed and be evolving and so on. So I said to my foreign minister, who by the way, she is an amazing foreign minister. She's Alicia Buenrostro, who used to be an undersecretary here, and she's so active and committed and so on. So when we said, Minister, we need to start from scratch, and from scratch I mean that in the foreign ministry, the first thing that you think about a feminist foreign policy is that women in foreign policy should be empowered at some point in order to be able to assume better positions and be in the decision-making process and so on, and take higher responsibilities. So we said, yes, we need to start, and we need to start from scratch, and that means like starting by, latency rooms, with positions for women who have children that are very little children or are in their adolescence, and that they can only work part-time, but that doesn't mean that they are affected or impacted negatively in the way they can still keep on moving in their careers, that we move from diplomatic attaché to a third secretary, second secretary, and in the case of Mexico it's done through very competitive exams, so it's a worn out process of around 20 years. So we said, yes, we need to start from that. Then having, of course, we need our partners to be able to work whenever they accompany us at an embassy and we are posted somewhere. If our husband, partner, wife, whatever it is, if they cannot develop themselves and be a constructive part in the relationship, it's a very difficult one. So it's important to have, sign all possible agreements so that partners are able also to work. So that sort of things from the very beginning, and for us, it's like really starting to help women at the foreign ministry and start to empower them. So I want to say back again, I want to say thank you and come back to how did we start. So I'll divide my 5-minute intervention in 3 parts. I'll talk about the Mexican feminist foreign policy and its elements. Then I will give some examples of feminist foreign policy actions. And lastly, I will share some details on the third feminist foreign policy that will be hosted by Mexico. And probably I will start by the third one. Mexico will be hosting the third feminist foreign policy. We have already had one in Germany, another one in the Netherlands, and Mexico will hold the third one. It will take place from July the 1st to July the 3rd. It will be presided over by our foreign minister. And yesterday we had a very interesting feminist foreign policy side event at CR1. It was packed. I was very happy about that. And we spoke about the different experiences in how we have implemented, because this is because it's a new way of doing things and it's a new avenue. We need the possibility of learning from different experiences becomes even more important. So we would love to see you all there. So for my country, for Mexico, having an FFP means not only that more women should be participating in foreign policy decisions, it also implies the mainstreaming of a gender perspective in all foreign relations. So we start from the beginning, as issues that I have mentioned, lactancy, rooms, and then having part-time positions and so on, and at the same time mainstreaming this gender perspective in all our foreign relations, in all the meetings, in all negotiations, even though if it's a free trade agreement, or if it's a cultural agreement or whatever, just do not forget about the gender perspective here. And of course, women's and girls' rights in all their diversity, and recognizing the contributions of women to diplomacy and to international politics. So Mexico, as Lina said, we announced the adoption of this feminist foreign policy in January 2020, so it's been 4 years. At that time, Mexico proposed that this initiative was a set of principles that seek to guide actions to reduce and to eliminate structural differences, gaps, and gender inequalities, so as to build a more just and prosperous society. Then Mexico became the first country in Latin America and in all the global south to announce its commitment to feminist foreign policy, promoting guidelines of a multilateral policy that would be dedicated to a gender equality and to a non-discrimination agenda. So our feminist foreign policy recognizes and is coherent with Mexico's very long tradition in multilateral fora promoting the recognition of women's, girls' and rights. And the FFP is equally consistent with the committed practice of consular protection. And so now I will comment on the 5 principles of our feminist foreign policy. Number 1, the first one proposes to maintain and strengthen Mexico's leadership in at the international stage to advance multilateral agenda towards gender equality. The second one, its principle, is about parity, and it builds on Mexico's advances on this area, promoting parity in Mexican foreign service. We have still a lot to do in this area. I can tell you that only around 37% of the total number of ambassadors have become women ambassadors, and that we still are very much lagging behind. Now, I would also like to say that in terms of parity, in the case of Mexico, we achieved full gender parity at Congress, both in the upper and in the lower chambers of Congress, and we will have the first presidential woman president, because both the candidate from the opposition and the candidate from the official party both are women. So this is the first time in a 200-year history of an independent country that we will have a woman president at the top. Third, the third principle refers to a zero-tolerance policy to harassment and gender violence. We have been very active in this regard. The Foreign Ministry has taken also, and in particular the Foreign Minister herself, this very seriously. We have an ethics committee, a commission that follows and takes action, and this is also in our diplomatic and the consular branches that we have. Remember that Mexico has only in this country 53 consulates, because we have the presence of more than 40 million people of Mexican origin living in the United States. The fourth principle promotes the recognition of contributions made by women diplomats to diplomacy and to foreign policy. And finally, the fifth one stands for addressing intersecting forms of discrimination faced by women and girls, including those based on race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, disability, and other factors. We have been here at the United Nations very, very active in this regard. If it's about women with disabilities, indigenous women, of course, girls, and sexuality of any form. So we have been very active and outspoken in this regard. And Mexico's feminist foreign policy must be, we realize that it has to be comprehensive, action-oriented, and a multi-actor instrument which includes civil society and other actors' contributions. We have already listened in the case of Finland. democracy flourishes where civil society plays a constructive role. Mexican civil society is much more, I would say 25 years ago or 30 years ago, it was the very beginning of this process. Now you can tell and you can see how only here at the CSW, you look around and there are students all around, representatives from NGOs, and we believe that they are very strong voice, represent a very strong voice and force in order to be able to move things forward. So since the adoption of our FFP and honoring Mexico's tradition on multilateral spaces, progress has been made on the implementation of feminist foreign policies. I'm sure we'll have more time to share about these experiences, and I'll mention some of the experiences and examples in different foreign policy areas. So first, one of Mexico's achievements within the framework of its feminist foreign policy is the co-presidency together with France of the Generation Equality Forum, where the Global Alliance for Care was launched with the committed cooperation of UN Women. Yes, absolutely. Yes, now, so I think that Generation Equality Forum was a completely different way of structuring things and presenting them. The fact that it was a multi-stakeholders with lots of alliances and so on. We need to keep on going, and we need to keep on doing our homework in that regard. Secondly, we just became a few days ago co-chairs with Spain of the group of feminist foreign policy countries here, of the 19 countries that have so far feminist foreign policy. So for a year, Spain and Mexico will be presiding over. Our first event was yesterday, and that group is, as I said, here in New York, and we will keep on doing lots of things. First of all, now we want to launch our logo, to have a logo of what it means, feminist foreign policy. So we need to think about the main elements and ingredients that need to be in that beautiful logo that I imagine. Okay, then also within the framework of its feminist foreign policy, Mexico has adopted 2 national action plans resulting from agreements negotiated at the multilateral level. So in January 2021, Mexico adopted its first national action plan on the implementation of Resolution 1325 that all of you, we all know about it, on women, peace and security, and follow up on the women, peace and security agenda in 2023. Mexico promoted and launched the Ibero-American Network of Women Mediators. That, I believe, is a very important thing. There are many alliances that are made up of different mediators. I believe very much, if we're saying here at the UN that women have all these characteristics within their identity, the way of their sensitivity and the way they do things in general, from more feminist energy and so on, and that as leaders we can do a lot in terms of peace processes. I also believe that we needed from our region as well, Spain, Portugal, and the rest of the Americas, to have our own, because they are already in Europe, they are already in Asia, and so on. What we really want to do is to see mediators moving in the ladder. We need to know more about what have been the experiences of others, work on training and capacity building, and then see how we can really promote them to be part of the group or the team of the special representative of the Secretary General, let's say to Myanmar or to whatever, Bosnia, Herzegovina, or the Sahara, the Western Sahara, and so on. We need to do that because if we believe we cannot only rely on quotas and so on. I believe much more. I think they are important, but I believe as well that we really need to prepare ourselves. The same way as, for example, now in my country and in general in Europe or in the United States, they need, all firms, all enterprises need for their advisory boards, they need women. And they cannot put women just because you are a woman. You also need to be related to the matters and be acquainted and have studied in this regard. So we need also to prepare ourselves because there are many fields. But the one I love the most is mediation. And I believe that, for example, in the case of my country, which, you know, it's Mexico, it's a great country. I've been serving it for 33 years already. But we also face many, many challenges. And those challenges have to do with inequality and have to do, in that regard, with poverty. And it has to do also with security, safety, and so on, because of the drugs issue that come to the United States. So in that regard, I believe that women are the most important factor to recover the social tissue in my country. And in the same way, I believe that in the international arena and in the international dimension, they have a very important role to play. So we launched that Ibero-American mediation group a few months ago, and it had its first meeting only 3 weeks ago. So we're very interested also in creating synergies with other groups of mediation. And lastly, I'm very happy to share what I said, that we will host the International Summit in July with Alicia Buenrostro. The summit will propose to connect its debates with discussions taking place on the Pact of the Future. So if you remember well, the Pact of the Future has several chapters. You know, it has peace and security, it has development, it has technology, innovation, and so on. It has governance. What else?
Multilateral reform and
multilateral reform and future generations. So we are connecting all these chapters of the Pact of the Future before we have the Summit of the Future in September with our feminist foreign policy, and finding an avenue where we can match those and see where the gender issue and action-oriented issues we can identify, and that might probably we will be able to bring them to the Pact of the Future. So this summit, we will have discussion panels, current policies and strategies on gender equality in foreign policy. We will explore those. We will try to identify best practices and lessons learned, analyze the main challenges and obstacles hindering progress in gender equality in foreign policy, and of course trying to propose some solutions. Let's start. I think that we will invite countries, of course all of you, but also the ones with feminist foreign policies. And we want, for example, one particular country, if it's on technologies, let's say Finland, no? And to Finland, you know, with its group working in the summit, have one action, you know, to be proposed. So that in the end we have 5 actions, only 5, because what we need to do is really feed up and try for this to evolve in a nicely constructive and positive way, and have innovative solutions. So in this regard, we are counting with you, and we would love to see you, all of you. I don't know whether it will be in Cancun or in Mexico City, but whatever it is, it will be an amazing summit. So we would like to have you there, and we look forward to seeing you. Okay.
Thank you so much. Alicia, you will definitely see me.
Okay, very good. Very good.
Khuri,
Thank
I
you.
think you want to go to another
Go
meeting.
to another meeting, but thank you.
Thank
I
you.
will
Thank
put
you.
it
Thank you,
mildly.
Lini. Yeah. Thanks
No,
a
I hate
lot.
to say it, FFP and for hematologists is fresh frozen plasma. What you give to stop bleeding in a pregnant woman who has
Very good. Take care. Thank you.
Life saving.
Yes, yes, like both FFPs.
Thank you. I want to turn to Åsa. Åsa is currently the CEO of Save the Children and the former Minister for Children, the Elderly and Gender Equality in Sweden. It's a funny combination, isn't it? I mean, you know, it just cannot be just Minister of Gender Equality. It has to be
A lot of other stuff.
Yes.
but actually, first of all, thank you for being with us, Åsa. And you were a Minister for Gender Equality. It was under your watch that you know, Sweden developed its first the first feminist foreign policy. And when we were having a conversation in preparation for this event, we talked about going back. So the first country to have a proper foreign feminist policy and the first country to retract, which is really unfortunate. So could you comment on this track and on this journey and what has it meant, but also what have been the issues and the challenges for Sweden's foreign feminist policy?
Absolutely. Well, thank you everybody, Minister. Thank you to all of you for being here and for this discussion. And thank you, Lina, for your leadership throughout the years. And we met each other because I've just done 5 years at UN Women with Lopa and under Sean, other beautiful colleagues from UN Women, where I think we also have the benefit of comparing and seeing things, different strategies that countries, member states take on. So I think, Lina, you and I, we talk about a lot of things when we discuss because there's so much to analyze, and I think we're all very concerned about where the world is at the moment. And we on the same day, we need to discuss Gaza, Haiti, Sudan, still Sahel, Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine. Luckily we have women colleagues from most of these countries here and many others as well, where there are crises going on. But I think that feminist foreign policy really is one of the solutions, and we were saying, had more countries really pursued feminist foreign policy, we would have a ceasefire.
Yes.
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 And I think that I also think that before I'll try to be brief, but because there's so many experienced colleagues here and so much to talk about. But I think it's also important to acknowledge, before we kind of dive into all the hostilities and attacks on human rights and women's and girls' rights at the moment, and the fundamentalism and the violence that's going on, I think it is important to remember, and that's what the CSW is about, that no one would have been here had it not been for feminists. And we would never have had the gains that we have had it not been for all of you. Because nothing in politics happens just like that. Feminism and women's rights is about shifting power. And as far as I know, very few men, because they have the majority of the power, wake up in the morning and say, I think I'm going to write a law today that actually makes me lose quite a lot of that power. It doesn't work like that. It works with women working together in many different ways. And had women not done that, we wouldn't have had the cede or the 1325, the Beijing platform, the CSW, and the all these important vehicles that we all relate to. Neither would we have legislation against violence against women, female genital mutilation, education for girls, etc., etc. So I think it's important to just remember that it is possible to change, and it is the fruit of work of women, and we can do it again, hopefully together with more men. And I think feminist foreign policy, I was the Minister of Gender Equality from 2014 to 18, and many of you I know my dear friend and colleague Margot Wallström, who was the foreign minister at the time. We are very good friends and we hang out a lot, but I think it's very important to acknowledge Margot and her vision for this. So she was the foreign minister, I was the gender equality minister at the time. And Margot's recipe for this were to set up these 3 R's, the resources, rights and representation, to go with it. And it was also at a time where Sweden was running for a seat at the Security Council, which also succeeded. And as far as I understand, in relation to many of the votes and the analysis of those votes was, to a large extent because of this focus and the focus on women, children, and people in the Security Council. So I know also many years later there are many countries or the group is growing of countries who are acknowledging the feminist foreign policy as their own, or who are very interested or working with women's rights as a focus of foreign policy. And I know also that this has been evaluated in different ways throughout the years. And these have been years with more and more attacks on women's and girls' rights. So I think it has been very important. I think the Me Too situation and the courageous women that came forward gave it another push. And I think that now it's really important to create some kind of pressure that in that way, again, it's much needed. In those follow-ups and evaluations, I know we have seen that a feminist foreign policy really does help when it comes to allocating resources, pursuing rights, driving rights, and to promote women's representation. However, it's far too slow, and it's not enough. And I think now that I'm leading a girls' and children's rights organization, Save the Children, a very well-known organization, also the work of activists, I am very happy about the fact that children's rights get a lot of attention and resources, but I don't understand why women's organizations don't get the same attention and resources. I've never understood that, and I won't, because they are really connected, and they really, we really need to allocate resources to both of them. I do think that women with power are still a bit scary, and I do think that you hesitate to really invest and really, really support the power of women in this sense, and that is at least part of it. I think that in times that we encounter now, it's important to build on these initiatives, and I do think that feminist foreign policy actually works. I think that some of the challenges, at least from where I sat at the time as a minister for gender equality, both with the domestic and international responsibility, from the beginning, I think that there was a lack of perhaps connection between, let's say, the national feminists and the feminist foreign policy, because those were groups who worked with the world. And I think that national grassroots organizations in any country, and UN Women works a lot with that, need to be connected. They know about violence against women, they know about the needs for shelters, they know about which women could actually be on lists for mediation or for political parties or for leadership. They know deep down what the issues are. So I think connection between the policies, diplomats, their money, their circles, and grassroots women is absolutely key. And I think Sweden did that in the world well, but I think it has taken time before the whole society is really part of that ambition to point to something. I think that it was perceived sometimes also as more words than action, but I do think now that we see that it actually did mean action. I think it is also through examples, not least that UN Women has from many countries, it does change who comes to the table, whose voice is important, who is seen as a leader. And I do think that we need to get away from situations where there is a discussion about peace, and those who created the violence are those who are seen as legitimate to decide about peace, whereas women who think they have something to say don't even have money to pay for the bus tickets to go through the country. Yeah. And I think that's a situation we just really have to understand and solve. And sometimes you at UN Women encounter that. Even that powerful countries and even UN agencies would say, could you fund tiny UN Women compared to many of the others, those women's bus ride to the table? And it's like, maybe you can, because you are, you are the one who has the power and the money. So I think we need still to shift this thinking of who is important. But my answer, I think, Lina, to your question, how does it work? Yes. How does it work? Well, it works well. It's a good vehicle to achieve the main goals of peace and prosperity, to address poverty, which is the theme of this of CSW, and to not perpetuate violence. But I do think, as always, when we talk about women's rights, to be committed not only from the feminist side themselves, but from the whole society. That is really the thing, and to really invest in women and children, and have a vision and a thought with that, and also propose legislation and reform with the goal of shifting that power, speaking out and defending and financing reforms that actually aim for that power shift. That is really important. It's seldom a by effect of something else. If you want to shift that power, you have to speak about that and express your political will. So I think it is a lot about that.
Thank you so much, Åsa. And thank you for having a critical look at what has been happening. I know that a minister has to leave us, so
Unfortunately,
don't worry.
we have to run.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. But it was a pleasure meeting you all, and I wish I had more time.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
All the best.
I'm going to do a minor shift in the program, so moving from ex-UN women to current UN women, and then to Aruna, just because it makes some things it makes sense to continue on that flow. So I want to welcome a very dear friend, Lopa Banerjee, the director of the Civil Society division at UN Women, and we often talk, Lopa, and I think we're both equally worried about the increasing polarization, the increasing inability to have a proper conversation on many fronts, and also on the rise of the anti-rights, anti-gender movements, which in many parts of the world happen to be militarized as well. It's not just a tough conversation, it's actually a very unequal conversation. And we talk also about, this is considered to be what our governments in the global south are interested in, which is matters of national security. They are matters of national security, but it doesn't matter when the impact is on the lives of women and girls and non-binary folks and so on. So I wanted to ask you to just basically think about the connections and the links between this increasingly obviously violent rise in anti-rights movement, the ways in which national security sees it equally. I mean, it sees it and it sees gender equality equally as a threat, both of them as a threat. And where do you see feminist foreign policies and everything that you've done so far in relation to generation equality as basically trying to navigate what is otherwise an explosive, literally and figuratively, ecosystem. So over to you, Lopa.
Thank you, Lina, and thank you very much for this lovely venue, of course, such an intimate conversation, but also for staging this conversation at this very, very consequential time. At all points in time when feminist foreign policy, the idea came up, and this was developed, even at its outset, at all times, it is important. But at this point in time, when it is such a moment of consequence in the world, when nearly half the world is going to be heading to the polls, and whether you are having elections in your country or not, those polls that are taking place in over 60 countries of the world, including the largest democracies, will affect the manner in which the foreign policy and relations are affected, and this question. So to that, I'm going to actually I'm going to separate your question from talking about, what does a feminist lens when we talk about this? How does that apply when we talk in terms of foreign policy and then today's world? So the feminist lens, the starting point is that feminist movements broke apart the idea that some people counted more than others. And so in itself, a feminist lens fundamentally, and many people spoke about it, challenges the hierarchies of power, both implicit and explicit. Institutional. Alicia spoke of the manner in which the feminist foreign policy is being institutionalized internally within the institutional structures themselves. But it promotes also the notion of individual and collective agency. And then the aspects of solidarity, equity, access, autonomy, and accountability are cornerstones of any kind of feminist framing or thinking. What does that mean when we are applying it to foreign policy? It means that it is diplomacy that promotes diversity and inclusion, not just internally, but diversity and inclusion as an objective of foreign policy and diplomatic engagement. Non-discrimination. So that non-discrimination is an objective, both a framing objective and a policy objective. And of course, equal opportunities, dialogue and networking. But it also means, in today's context, that a foreign policy that is feminist is looking at center staging as a policy objective, alliances and coalitions with movements involved in the safeguarding of democracy and rights. And a foreign policy framing that prioritizes solidarity. Because what are we in terms of, if we now come to today's world, of course, the progress on gender equality has been glacially so slow. And this is one of the reasons why the whole feminist foreign policy initiative came up. Of course, there is, we know all this, sluggish political will, not enough investment in gender equality, the pushback that everybody has talked about. But what we are seeing in nations today is communities that are impoverished by global pandemics, climate catastrophes, austerity measures, volatile and insecure economies, eroding trust in public institutions because they are failing to deliver goods and services to their people. And this is leading to disintegrating faith in democratic systems and democratic systems that are atrophying. And so you have disillusioned citizens who are not engaging within the governance structures and are creating this vacuum that undemocratic actors are stepping into. And so, in the world, we have the return of power politics and a contested multipolar world, the threats and challenges that are linked to specific geographical focal points in the world, as well as all of the emerging and transnational threats related to cybersecurity, terrorism, etc. So in this context, what is the call for feminist foreign policy today, looking at this situation? It has to be that the feminist foreign policy demand or the framing, and in that it is different from conventional foreign policy, is that it is able to develop the partnerships and strategies that is able to address national conservatism and the politics, what I'm calling the politics of grievance, the against policies in countries, against immigrants, against LGBTI people, against the racially marginalized, against minorities, the against politics that are part of national conservatism. the feminist foreign policy, when we talk in terms of what it is doing externally and internally, this has to be able, feminist foreign policy has to be able to frame this. And in this it is different from a conventional policy. It has to be able to be a strong voice that argues against the capture of state institutions, courts, universities, independent press. We are not seeing that framing in feminist foreign policy in its specific ways now that addresses this, and to focus. I mean, there is such an opportunity because of the way in which it was instituted and its principles of feminist framing, for feminist foreign policy to really focus on consensus building in global diplomacy. And that is crucial for advancing gender equality, and it is completely hobbled right now in this environment of distrust. And so for feminist foreign policy to be able to support multilateral feminist activism, feminist activists have worked forever with policymakers in national and in international spaces, with the UN, for gender equality outcomes. But it is this activism, this feminist multilateral activism, and these alliances, these spaces for shared policy dialogue that are facing this ferocious and coordinated pushback from multilateral actors themselves, the governments. And so to reinforce global solidarity and provide an entry point for countries to advocate in international forums together on feminist principles, this is a key ask of the framing of feminist foreign policy in today's context, to prioritize the multi-stakeholder alliances, you were talking about it earlier, Åsa, to be able to the inclusive open spaces for dialogue that you referred to, Alicia, in terms of the manner in which the dialogue in Mexico will take place. Really prioritizing this intergenerational and intersectional solidarity building, and being able to amplify what is happening. Of course, there are all of the various feminist foreign policy or foreign policy that prioritizes gender equality outcomes are driving money in different ways now to community groups and women's rights groups, and but to be able to navigate and negotiate the political and fiscal space within countries for these groups to work. It's not just enough to drive money, but there has to be an advocating for the expansion of the space for these actors to work within this. And we can come back to the SWANA region and the countries of the SWANA region. I think that there is such an important opportunity at this point in time for this, where there is an ability right now to create a new framing around gender inequality as a national security issue. Yes. Gender inequality creates social fragmentation. It is, and so promoting social cohesion, and in the countries of the SWANA region, this is also so culturally specific. Women are the glue. The women create networks. They operate. They create through their engagement. Social cohesion. So denying women the ability to have space in public and private space to be able to create those networks of solidarity in public and private spaces, that results in creating conditions of insecurity. And I think this framing of a different understanding of security from as located in inequality it takes it out of the militarization framework, and it's an opportunity to really think through this and create and bring some examples around this. So I'm going to stop here to say that the notion of feminist foreign policy or foreign policy that prioritizes gender equality outcomes has driven a lot of different engagement. But at this point in time, the framing that set it up no longer holds in the context of a very contested and polarized environment. And therefore, the ability of the foreign policy framing to address that polarization from that feminist lens will have to be key for it to do.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Lina, and thank you very much for this lovely venue, of course, such an intimate conversation, but also for staging this conversation at this very, very consequential time. At all points in time when feminist foreign policy, the idea came up and this was developed, even at its outset, at all times, it is important. But at this point in time, when it is such a moment of consequence in the world, when nearly half the world is going to be heading to the polls, and whether you are having elections in your country or not, those polls that are taking place in over 60 countries of the world, including the largest democracies, will I'm going to separate your question from talking about, what is a feminist lens when we talk about this? How does that apply when we talk in terms of foreign policy and then today's world? So the feminist lens, the starting point is that feminist movements broke apart the idea that some people counted more than others. And so in itself, a feminist lens fundamentally, and many people spoke about it, challenges the hierarchies of power, both implicit and explicit. Institutional. Alicia spoke of the manner in which the feminist foreign policy is being institutionalized internally within the institutional structures themselves. But it promotes also the notion of individual and collective agency. And then the aspects of solidarity, equity, access, autonomy, and accountability are cornerstones of any kind of feminist framing or thinking. What does that mean when we are applying it to foreign policy? It means that it is diplomacy that promotes diversity and inclusion, not just internally, but diversity and inclusion as an objective of foreign policy and diplomatic engagement. Non-discrimination. So that non-discrimination is an objective, both a framing objective and a policy objective. And of course, equal opportunities, dialogue and networking. But it also means, in today's context, that a foreign policy that is feminist is looking at center staging as a policy objective, alliances and coalitions with movements involved in the safeguarding of democracy and rights. And a foreign policy framing that prioritizes solidarity. Because what are we in terms of, if we now come to today's world, of course, the progress on gender equality has been glacially so slow. And this is one of the reasons why the whole feminist foreign policy initiative came up. Of course, there is, we know all the sluggish political will, not enough investment in gender equality, the pushback that everybody has talked about. But what we are seeing in nations today is communities that are impoverished by global pandemics, climate catastrophes, austerity measures, volatile and insecure economies, eroding trust in public institutions because they are failing to deliver goods and services to their people. And this is leading to disintegrating faith in democratic systems and democratic systems that are atrophying. And so you have disillusioned citizens who are not engaging within the governance structures and are creating this vacuum that undemocratic actors are stepping into. And so, in the world, we have the return of power politics and a contested multipolar world, the threats and challenges that are linked to specific geographical focal points in the world, as well as all of the emerging and transnational threats related to cybersecurity, terrorism, etc. So in this context, what is the call for feminist foreign policy today, looking at this situation? It has to be that the feminist foreign policy demand or the framing, and in that it is different from conventional foreign policy, is that it is able to develop the partnerships and strategies that is able to address national conservatism and the politics, what I'm calling the politics of grievance, the against policies in countries, against immigrants, against LGBTI people, against the racially marginalized, against minorities, the against politics that are part of national conservatism. The feminist foreign policy, when we talk in terms of what it is doing externally and internally, this has to be able, feminist foreign policy has to be able to frame this. And in this it is different from a conventional policy. It has to be able to be a strong voice that argues against the capture of state institutions, courts, universities, independent press. We are not seeing that framing in feminist foreign policy in its specific ways now that addresses this, and to focus. There is such an opportunity because of the way in which it was instituted and its principles of feminist framing, for feminist foreign policy to really focus on consensus building in global diplomacy. And that is crucial for advancing gender equality, and it is completely hobbled right now in this environment of distrust. And so for feminist foreign policy to be able to support multilateral feminist activism, feminist activists have worked forever with policymakers in national and in international spaces, with the UN, for gender equality outcomes. But it is this activism, this feminist multilateral activism, and these alliances, these spaces for shared policy dialogue that are facing this ferocious and coordinated pushback from multilateral actors themselves, the governments. And so to reinforce global solidarity and provide an entry point for countries to advocate in international forums together on feminist principles, this is a key ask of the framing of feminist foreign policy in today's context. To prioritize the multi-stakeholder alliances, you were talking about it earlier, Åsa, to be able to the inclusive open spaces for dialogue that you referred to, Alicia, in terms of the manner in which the dialogue in Mexico will take place. Really prioritizing this intergenerational and intersectional solidarity building, and being able to amplify what is happening. Of course, there are all of the various actors that have got feminist foreign policy or foreign policy that prioritizes gender equality outcomes are driving money in different ways now to community groups and women's rights groups, but to be able to navigate and negotiate the political and fiscal space within countries for these groups to work. It's not just enough to drive money, but there has to be an advocating for the expansion of the space for these actors to work within this. And we can come back to the SWANA region and the countries of the SWANA region. I think that there is such an important opportunity at this point in time for this, where there is an ability right now to create a new framing around gender inequality as a national security issue.
Yes.
You know, gender inequality creates social fragmentation.
Yes.
It is SWANA region. You know, this is also so culturally specific. Women are the glue. You know, the women create networks. They operate. They create through their engagement. You know, social cohesion. So, denying women the ability to have space in public and private space to be able to create those networks of solidarity in public and private spaces, that results in creating conditions of insecurity. And I think this framing of a different understanding of security from as located in inequality it takes it out of the militarization framework, and it's an opportunity to really think through this and create and bring some, you know, examples around this. So I'm going to stop here to say that you know, the notion of feminist foreign policy or foreign policy that prioritizes gender equality outcomes has driven a lot of different engagement. But at this point in time, the framing that set it up no longer holds in the context of a very contested and polarized environment.
Yeah.
And therefore, the ability of the foreign policy framing to address that polarization from that feminist lens will have to be key for it too.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lopa. It's well, we'll be hearing Lopa soon in Lebanon, hopefully, talking about. Shall I spill the bean? What is the topic of our conversation?
Please.
The disagreeable conversations, I think. And I think what Lopa brings every time is the ability to disagree, to discuss the root causes of the disagreement and what can be fixed and what, you know, we have to accept it shall never be fixed. So, but thank you so much, Lopa. I want to turn to Dr. Aruna Rao. Aruna is, first, of course, a very long-time friend, I would say. I'm very, very proud to say that she's a senior international fellow at the Asfari Institute and also the chair of Oxfam International Board of Directors. But also Aruna is many, many, many more things, and you know, and a celebrity in her own right as an amazing global feminist activist. So again, when we were discussing, you know, how we would frame the conversation here, I think we wanted to talk about, in your view, and given that the work that you've been doing recently in the recent year, what would make a feminist foreign policy meaningful, impactful, relevant in a world that is becoming, again, very difficult to understand and to deal with, and in a world that is becoming very violent, very discriminatory, and very oppressive? What would make feminist foreign policies impactful and meaningful in such a challenging context, I would say globally?
Well,
it's an
thank
easy
you.
question.
Huh?
It's an easy question.
It is, yes. Why not tackle it? Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here in this gorgeous setting. Delighted to be connected to the Asfari Institute. And hello, everybody. I'd like to say, first off, feminist foreign policies are not my area of expertise. I am a feminist advocate, a researcher. I can ask some questions, and maybe there are many others who are much better placed than me to answer those questions. But that's kind of what I think I'll do. There are many instruments for addressing the kinds of gender inequality challenges we have been talking about for decades, right?
Yeah.
There are many, many, many. CEDAW is one of them, 1325. You can name many, many. But here we're talking about feminist foreign policies. Okay. One of the big challenges is it's unclear what feminist foreign policies actually mean.
Absolutely.
Okay, what is it? How many countries now? I thought 17. 19 you're saying, Alicia.
Can I say including Libya? I don't know what to think about
Okay.
this. But
Okay. So 19 countries have said they have a feminist foreign policy. But what does that mean? It's hard to discern because this is kind of a moving train. Okay? So
yeah.
I am the co-founder of Gender at Work, as some of you may know. I started the Gender at Work podcast a couple of years ago. Our most recent podcast was on feminist foreign policies. Are they really feminist? So I would encourage you to go listen. In that podcast, we talked to your friend Margot Wallström, right? Said, okay, so what was in 2014 when you developed this? As you rightly pointed out, Åsa, there were three things that Margot was interested in, particularly rights, representation, and resources, okay? Now, the way in which that has gotten interpreted by a number of different countries, including Mexico, we also spoke to Nadine Dasman, whom you know very well, is in terms of, okay, looking at gender parity issues within the Foreign Service. So, Nadine said, as Alicia pointed out earlier, putting gender equality at the center, which means more opportunities for women in the Foreign Service. It means promoting gender equality in foreign policy generally, trade agreements, other things like that. Now, there is actually a index that many of you are probably familiar with, which Lyric Thompson did at ICRW some time ago, that's really built on Margot's vision, right? All right. Now, there is a very different way of thinking about what should a feminist foreign policy do, okay? And I think, and I would put to us that the way in which we're interpreting it silos us. It silos us into focusing on, Beth just, the other day, Beth Waronick, in a LinkedIn post reminded us that OECD DAC has put out its latest data on where is the money going, right? The money, official money, ODA to women's organizations to gender equality is at 4%. So I point that out because are we going to focus on that 4% in the broader context, looking at gender parity, etc., or are we going to say, what really does feminist foreign policy mean? And, Lopa started on this, I'm going to challenge you a bit. Feminist foreign policy is not only about diplomatic relations. It's about military policy, it's about trade, it's about investment, it's about commercial interests, it's about intelligence services, it's about crime, right? And it requires a rethink, a fundamental rethink in the way countries relate to each other, right? So, luckily, there's also a very good index available. I don't know if Foteni is in the room.
No, she's not here.
She's not, okay.
Yeah.
Well, Foteni Papagiotti, who is at ICRW, she's the Director for Advocacy and Strategy, thank God for her, when she was sitting around doing her master's, came up with an absolutely brilliant idea. Hey, let's look at lots of other issue areas. Why don't we look at peace and militarization, how much money is going into militarization, how much money is going into defense budgets. Let's look at ODA, let's look at migration, let's look at protections for labor, let's look at economic justice, institutional commitments that governments have made, and climate, okay? That's a really good index. Sweden comes out on top. The US comes out at the bottom. No, I think Israel comes out at the bottom. But, US and Israel are at the bottom, as it should be. So that index gives you a clue as to how to unpack what feminist foreign policy is, which is not only about gender parity, it's not only about how do you look at gender equality within these trade agreements and other agreements. It is about challenging the fundamental notion of what is national security, moving it towards a notion of human security. Okay? And if you don't do that, we are constantly siloed into, oh yeah, you women go play over there, and we big guys are going to talk about trade and militarization and defense spending and all the rest of it. Now, okay, don't take my word for it. Let's look at Yemen. Let's look at Gaza, right? There was recently a meeting in November in The Hague where a number of feminist countries who proclaim they have a feminist foreign policy met. The German women were challenging their German foreign minister, saying, we want to talk about Gaza, and it was shut down. I'm astounded at what the German government can do. The German government, I'm finding out, can tell, particularly immigrants who are Germans, so a Syrian German, or a Iranian German, or a Lebanese German, can tell them, if they're speaking in an open civil society space, can tell them, don't you go there, we're watching you. Yeah. Okay? This is a country that has declared it has a feminist foreign policy. Okay, so what do we have here? We have a continuum. That's the kindest way to put it. A continuum of what is feminist foreign policy. Okay? On the one hand, there are these, issues that all of my colleagues have talked about. Nobody is really challenging at a governmental level. Nobody is looking at that whole picture. What is defense spending? What are all of these issues? And in fact, the last OECD sort of review of, when they reviewed the gender equality strategy, recently after 15 years, and I know because Joanne Sandler and I wrote a paper for it, we raised this issue about the right hand can say one thing, and if the left hand is doing something completely different, that is not feminist. That does not get us to where we need to go. So I think we need to question that. What is the bar for joining this club? I'm not clear. I don't think anybody is really clear. Libya has joined. Excellent.
No.
Libya hasn't joined? You
It's
just
not
said that.
excellent. I'm just saying it's not
No, I'm
excellent.
saying, what is the bar? What is the bar? What is it really about, right? What's the cost of, who am I accountable to if I say I've adopted a feminist foreign policy? In every country it's very controversial, right? So in Mexico came out number 3 on that index that Foteni, developed, the ICRW index. And of course, Mexican feminists have challenged Mexico, saying, how can you say that when the domestic violence against women, right? The violence against women in Mexico is so high. How can you, with a brave face, say that on the, So that's an internal political issue in Mexico that women feminists in Mexico are bringing up. I've given you an example of what German feminists are doing and then how they've been slapped down, okay? So the first thing I want to say is that this is very unclear what it is. It goes from one end to the other. But I think we shouldn't lose the idea, we shouldn't let go of the idea that we have many instruments for looking at gender equality issues, many fora for looking at that, but this is a particular niche, this is a particular space to look at how do you shift this national interest, which has been defined, as Åsa said, by men, for men, elite men, in spaces where there aren't any women around. How do you shift that notion and really challenge that notion of what is state security, you know? And where these countries with feminist foreign policies choose to speak out and choose not to speak out, okay? So let's take the example of Sweden. Sweden, when Margot Wallström was minister, criticized Saudi Arabia for its human rights abuses, right? Luckily, the prime minister at the time supported her, but that wasn't the case when a Canadian foreign minister a few years later did a very similar thing, right? Okay, these are all stories, by the way, that a good friend of mine, a very brilliant political scientist, Anne-Marie Goetz, has told me, and if you really want to, get a very good analysis, go to stuff that Anne-Marie Goetz writes. So Canada had a very different response to this. So they backtracked. So when when can you call out the human rights abuses of your allies, right, under the guise of a feminist foreign policy, and when can you not, right? We're all facing Gaza, a continuing genocide, right? And okay, the United States has not said it's going to have feminist foreign policy. I can't imagine it ever would, but many European countries that have declared a feminist foreign policy are arming are arming Israel to the teeth. And that is causing the genocide of women and children in Gaza. So we cannot, on the one hand, say we care about women and children and then not question the foreign policy directions of countries that have said that this is their policy and are acting in a very different way, okay? So that's a fundamental contradiction. So let's focus in on that contradiction. You cannot talk about nutrition of women and girls in Yemen and at the same time be, allowing Saudi Arabia to fuel, to get their fuel to bomb Yemen. These things just don't work. They just don't sit together. So are we going to have a very siloed approach? Or are we going to have a more intersectional approach, right? If we do have a more intersectional approach, then we are in hot water. We are in kind of uncharted territory, because generally these two issues don't come together. The gender equality work and the work on national security interests have been always kept apart. And so, the question is, if we need to, and feminist foreign policy is a really important lever. It's an important lever to get at these issues. How do you use it to get at these issues in a way that exposes the contradictions, in a way that supports activists who are exposing the contradictions, and in a way that that we don't pat ourselves over the back saying, hey, we've done really well in terms of getting 40% women now within the Foreign Service. Last year we had 35. Let's look at some of these other issues, because we've got lots of other instruments that look at these questions of parity. Now, another, I think, a really important question, and I think Lopa touched on this in terms of talking about, foreign policies should center, feminist foreign policies should center solidarity. What we're not seeing in the case of, say, Afghanistan, of course, is, right? It's a total disaster when it comes to, and a unique kind of disaster when it comes to women's rights, right? I don't know, 54 out of the last 86 edicts have to do with women. And there is no collective voice of governments around what is what is an approach, what is a feminist approach to addressing that issue. Similarly, again, I have to say, with Gaza. So can countries raise their collective voice around these issues? And if not, why not? You know, what is the cost? Because as activists, we're disappointed. We're dismayed that this isn't happening. We're dismayed when governments tell us, no, we're not going to be talking about that. You know, Germany says it has a practical feminist foreign policy, and in the case of Ukraine, you know, they have of course, you know, armed and supported the war against Russia, but when it comes to Palestine and Gaza, is it racism that keeps them from doing that? What is it, you know? I mean, I think it's good to put these questions on the table because some of these policies are in fact racist. It's also really important for feminists, and I think feminists are trying to do this, but with very, very little resources, trying to, and maybe they're not doing it. Maybe they're not doing it enough. Certainly the voices in the United States, you know, where I live, there is no, I mean, we all pay taxes to the US government, but there is no collective domestic feminist voice that is taking this government or trying to hold this government to account. There are lots of protests. A lot of those protests are from the diaspora community. A lot of it is student-led. There are many communities, you know, Jewish communities who have led that protest, the not in my name communities. But the feminist sort of, the feminist presence, or whether, you know, whether you call it feminist or women's organizations actively doing that in the United States is really hasn't been there. Mm-hmm. So, you know, how can we as women, as feminists, be more organized to use our positions as, you know, as taxpayers, as people who, as a kind of a watchdog on, you know, our own governments. That's another piece of that security, another piece of that solidarity question. So I think what I'm going to do is to say, you know, Gandhiji, I come from India, so I should say something about Gandhiji. Gandhiji was once asked, as you all know, what does he think of the idea of Western civilization? And he said, I think that would be a good idea. And so I leave you with the idea, you know, here that feminist, what do I think of feminist foreign policies? I think it would be a good idea.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for raising the questions, because certainly this is work in progress. I think we're all in that phase of trying to understand what fits and what works for us, but also trying to understand, or trying to pose at least, the complicated and uncomfortable questions. So thank you so much. I want to move to Rahel. Rahel Beigel. Rahel is the UN representative and senior advocacy officer at Women's Refugee Commission, and she's also a colleague with the NGO CSW. You're the treasurer of the executive committee. And I've just realized that I have failed to mention at the very beginning that this event is co-organized, is a collaborative effort, and it's co-organized by AUB, the Permanent Mission of Mexico at the UN, and Finland as well. So I'm sorry I forgot this, in partnership with both UN Women and NGO CSW. So thank you so much for basically being part of this and being part of this very important and timely conversation. Rahel, so you know, we've had a really good conversation before, thinking about global issues, particularly in relation to women and girls, refugees, and we know that this is a global issue, that this is you know, it's going in crescendo, and it's not likely to be resolved anytime soon. So and I think, you know, we discussed the ways in which, in your opinion and where you stand in your position, how would it be possible to at least address and resolve, maybe not resolve, maybe just address the increasing oppression of women and girls and non-binary folks who are refugees across the globe, with an instrument such as feminist foreign policy. So what can make them, again, impactful at this level? Looking at the growing problem, I don't want to call it problem because it seems like it's the problem, refugees are the problem,
Right.
but the growing context that is pushing people to move against their will.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Abou Habib. Thank you to the Asfari Institute. And I'm very humbled to be lucky last in this group. And as former Minister Regnér said, people are afraid of powerful women, then this room must be absolutely terrifying. So the Women's Refugee Commission, we engage on feminist foreign policy and on the Women, Peace and Security framework, because these are mutually reinforcing frameworks. So FFP and WPS, I hope it's okay if I slip into acronyms, they have common goals, right? They both seek to uphold human rights, increase resources, and increase representation of women across all spaces in leadership, political representation, and both are rooted in the same principle that international cooperation cannot come at the expense or be subordinated to national interests. So our work in both spheres is aimed at strengthening protection mechanisms for forcibly displaced women, girls, and people of diverse sexual orientation and gender identities, and also promoting their meaningful engagement in all aspects of decision making and their leadership in conflict prevention, humanitarian response, peace negotiations, and peace building. So I had the great privilege of also being at two important conferences that happened this past November. So the first was our conference in The Hague, and Ambassador Massieu was there as well and gave a fantastic presentation, which we all appreciated. So I want to share a couple of reflections from that conference and from the one that was right after, which was the Women, Peace and Security Focal Points Network, in which I am also an active member as WRC's UN representative. So throughout both conferences, it was clear, and particularly the FFP conference, that the discourse around feminist foreign policy is gradually shifting in a positive direction. We are moving toward greater inclusion, realization of the aspirations for achieving this shared framework for foreign policy that's gender inclusive, gender affirming, anti-racist, and anti-colonial. It's remarkable that now we have 19 FFP countries, and we have 107 countries that have national action plans for implementation of the Women, Peace and Security framework. So this is all positive. The other positive is that the F of the FFP is undefined. And we want to keep it this way, because if we were to impose a monolithic definition of feminism, we would be undermining the goal of being anti-colonial and having global equity, right? Because feminism, as we know, is relative and means different things depending on geography, cultural context, ethnicity, and people's lived experiences. So we want to keep it that way. Throughout the conference, government and civil society, we addressed broad foreign policy considerations, trade and economy, climate, strategies for promoting equity among high GDP and low and middle income countries, which were all good things. So while we have all this positive momentum in these new national action plans, it's also important, I think, to ground ourselves in this moment and kind of zoom out and look at the global reality when it comes to forcibly displaced people. So the overarching goal, as we mentioned, of both of these frameworks is to promote greater international cooperation. But right now we have more than 600 million, that's 600 million, women and girls who live in conflict-affected contexts. And there are an estimated 110 million forcibly displaced people worldwide, more than half of whom are women and girls. So we also see recently the conflict in Sudan, where 10.7 million people have fled and another million are internally displaced. We're looking at the war in Ukraine, which caused 6 million Ukrainians to flee and upwards of 8 million internally displaced. And mind you, these are almost, I can't say all, but the vast majority of the Ukrainian population are women and girls, because men are not allowed to leave the country and men are being sent to the military, being sent to the front lines. You know, we're all mentioning Gaza, but it's important to also keep in mind that right now, as we sit in this room, there are 1.5 million people stuck in Rafah along the Egyptian border in increasingly dangerous and deteriorating conditions. We also see conditions in Syria deteriorating, where people have been now displaced multiple times. So starting in 2010, with the civil war, we see women and girls being forcibly displaced. And then we see, because of sectarian violence that is increasing, these populations are displaced again. Then because of the earthquake, they're further displaced. So while all of that is happening, we also just witnessed, very alarmingly, a measure by Pakistan to forcibly return Afghan refugees, many of whom had been there since the 1980s. And they forcibly return them to Afghanistan, and this constitutes a clear violation of Pakistan's obligation as a party to the UN Convention Against Torture and under customary international law to the principle of non-refoulement. So, in addition to these active conflicts, it doesn't stop there. We're seeing conditions everywhere: DRC, Yemen, Myanmar, Haiti, and in every country that's currently on the Security Council agenda get worse for women, girls, and people of diverse zodiacs. And we are seeing more countries, including this one, close their doors to refugees and people who are fleeing conflict and seeking safety. Egypt is closing its doors to Sudanese who are fleeing and to Palestinians. Turkey is closing its doors to Syrians. And throughout Europe, we've seen rising xenophobia, which is bolstered by this anti-gender movement. So the tensions between national interests and the imperatives of multilateralism play out in the Security Council every day. We have the permanent 5 members are continuously using their veto power to advance national interests at the expense of advancing action on conflict resolution and humanitarian intervention. And this is most glaringly evidenced by Russia discontinuing the Black Sea Grain Initiative in July 2023, which increased food insecurity in Africa. Also this past July, the Council failed to renew the Syria cross-border aid mechanism, which had previously allowed for the delivery of humanitarian assistance to internally displaced Syrians into non-government controlled areas without requiring the permission of the Assad regime. That's also gone. We're also facing the drawdown of UN mandates in countries like Sudan. UNITAMS is now dissolved. In DRC, the MONUSCO mandate is now dissolved. And in all of these contexts, we have at the same time the protection mechanisms that were supposed to be in place are not working. We have rising rates of gender-based violence. We have increasing prevalence of conflict-related sexual violence, and the perpetrators are acting with total impunity. So we have protection gaps in almost everywhere in the world where you have conflict, crisis, forcibly displaced populations. There are major protection gaps, and it is getting worse. So all of these developments point to an urgent need to reassess our approaches to protection and to participation. And so while a lot of the goals of feminist foreign policy overlap with the long-standing commitments of women, peace, and security, the feminist foreign policy can, at the very least, provide a unifying political framework for these disparate strands of gender-related strategies that are being implemented by governments, improve coordination and effectiveness, and involvement at the highest levels of government. But what's glaringly absent in all of this, and going back to reflections on the conference, is, while we're talking about trade, we had an entire session on feminist foreign policy and trade without once mentioning sanctions regimes and the impact of sanctions regimes on women's civil society. There were a lot of other gaps, and there's a heavy focus on gender parity and on increasing women in leadership. Yes, we need to increase women. It's not a box ticking exercise, right? When we say meaningful engagement and meaningful participation, we actually mean meaningful. Right, an actual shift, right? So, Dr. Rao, you mentioned that there's no domestic movement for a feminist foreign policy in the United States. I'm happy to say that that's not entirely true. So the Women's Refugee Commission was part of the Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition in the United States. And this is a coalition that is working to influence the United States government to develop a feminist foreign policy that would complement their new national action plan. So the United States government recently launched this new national action plan and a national strategy on women, peace, and security implementation. So WRC and our coalition partners are of the view that countries that are implementing a feminist foreign policy can and should look more deeply into the military trade nexus, look more critically at the harmful economic and trade policies, including extractive industries, and their migration and asylum policies, just to name a few. So some advocates of feminist foreign policy discuss whether increases in military spending can or should be justified if you have an FFP. And we question if specific military exports to countries, as Dr. Rao was discussing, with a poor record on women's rights, is really the best way of dealing with authoritarian actors that oppress women. So some of these debates, including the one on sanctions and the use of military force, are far from settled. In the advocacy work that we do, we shift the discourse away from calling for an end to military spending, full stop. What we do is we talk about security sector reform, which I want to get into in more detail later, and focusing on conflict prevention, right? Because it's when you start talking to member states about, you need to stop military spending, it's almost a dead-end argument, because they have a legal right to protect their sovereignty and to protect their national borders. And they have, you're not going to stop countries from spending on their own military. And I know that the realpolitik is quite depressing. But if you, in the work that we're doing in influencing member states, if you shift that conversation toward conflict prevention, towards strengthening women-led civil society as a means to conflict prevention, we have found that gains more traction, and you can get a little bit further. So back to our work with the U.S. government. So we've been working with the Biden-Harris administration, and they have had a lot of opportunities so far to apply a feminist lens to the current challenges, both here in the U.S. and abroad, again, due to all of these multiple protracted, complex crises and newly erupting wars. So we've been working with them on the Ukraine, Afghanistan, Sudan, and Ethiopia, and also on the crackdown on women's rights in Iran. After the Debs decision, the United States lost its moral high ground. Again, as you were saying, are we really in a position to lecture other member states about their progress on upholding gender equality when we just stripped reproductive choice away from our own citizens? So this all of these movements and all of this lobbying has set the tone for increased civil society action and increased civil society activism that have generated a critical mass around all these issues. So the administration has launched this national gender equity and equality strategy, and this is sort of their way of incrementally moving toward an FFP. So it's not saying, okay, the United States government is ready to have a feminist foreign policy. It's saying the United States government recognizes that in all of our foreign relations, again, across the full spectrum, we are going to center gender equality, which is good, but it's not necessarily the same as committing to gender transformative approaches. So despite all those incremental progress, there's really a lack of a meaningful focus on gender in the national security strategy. And again, this leads us back to the question of how can we discuss a feminist foreign policy if we are replicating the same discourse and using the same models for security. It just doesn't work. A feminist foreign policy needs also to be rooted in security sector reform. And this is why. Because the US government's WPS framework, and sorry if I'm jumping around here a lot, stick with me because I am getting somewhere. The WPS framework seeks to promote conflict prevention, but also includes explicitly countering violent extremism and countering terrorism. Okay, this sounds good, right? Wrong. Both CVE and CT, countering violent extremism and countering terrorism, have been instrumentalized to criminalize forcibly displaced populations, to criminalize asylum seekers, to criminalize migrants, to close borders, and to justify policies that push people back out into the Mediterranean where they drown, to push people back into the Sahara where they die from exposure, and to push people on our border, where we have a severe crisis that we're working to address. I'm happy that we are working together to address it, but it's dire and it's getting worse every day.
Absolutely.
And this argument of, well, we have to protect our borders from terrorists does not work, because we know that the vast majority of people who are seeking safety are women, girls, people who are criminalized on the basis of their sexual orientation and gender identity. They are not drug gangs and criminals and terrorists.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So we'll just fix that and go to lunch.
Very good.
So getting back to how
I'm on board.
There you go. There you go. So I don't want to get too much into the Security Council resolutions and everything. I'm happy to discuss that more in the Q&A. But I do want to talk about just two areas for growth and expansion, and where we see some promising inroads for implementation of both FFP and WPS, again, as mutually enforcing frameworks. So the first is in monitoring and accountability. So thank you very much for raising this FFP index that the ICRW started. And we do have our colleagues from the FFP Collaborative in the room, I believe, unless they have left. They just left? Oh, because they knew I was going to talk about them. Who I was hoping could speak more to the Feminist Foreign Policy Index and how it's not used to measure or to give a grade to countries on how good their policy is necessarily, but more to send a signal that there are benchmarks, and we want to take an overall assessment, like a global view of what is the status of FFP, where are the trends, and where can civil society focus our engagement with government and policymakers in order to close the gaps, right? So that offers one good tool. Pardon? There are two indexes, yes. So, but having this framework overall offers a good tool for monitoring and accountability, but it needs to be expanded and it needs to be systematized in some way, right? Because the other fundamental challenge is that FFP, unlike national action plans on WPS, they're not legally binding documents, right? They're
Yes.
just expressions of a country's aspiration and of a country's ethos when it comes to gender equality, which also means that they are inherently partisan and they're political documents, which is why they
Yeah.
can be dispensed of at the whim. A national action plan cannot, because every resolution that is passed by the Security Council is automatically binding upon all member states. So it's a lot harder to ditch your national action plan than it is to ditch your feminist foreign policy. But if they were both subject to the same kind of scrutiny by, international scrutiny, and held to the same standards of implementation, then I think we would have stronger ground to carry all of this momentum forward. So that's another problem that we can fix and then go to lunch.
Very good.
Yeah. So that's one. And then the second is looking at resourcing and financing. So the Women's Refugee Commission just concluded our 2-year term on the board of the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, which UN Women serves as the secretariat. And I'm very happy to say that for us at the WRC, serving on the board of the fund was an extremely proud moment. It is something that I am so proud of. I can't talk enough about the when it comes to foreign humanitarian assistance to women-led organizations that are responding to conflict and crisis, it's even less, okay? We're looking and other partners developed this Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund, which is, in very brief explanation, a multi-sectoral pooled funding mechanism which includes governments, private sector, UN agencies, and civil society members. And it is designed to deliver direct, multi-year, flexible funding into the hands of grassroots women organizations. And it's designed to be very nimble and very agile. So there are 3 main funding windows. One is a crisis response window, which puts money into the hands of organizations as they're responding to an acute crisis. And during our time on the board, we were able to support opening up new windows to respond to particular country contexts, like the floods in Libya. There's also a funding window that provides operational support. So with the understanding that you can't just find, okay, here's some money to get through this crisis. No, we're funding sustainability, we're funding the long-term health and vitality of women's civil society, again, so that they can operate across the conflict prevention, humanitarian intervention, peace building, recovery, reconstruction, across that whole continuum.
Very good.
It is good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing, and you're and Mexico is a member.
Yeah.
So thank you for your contributions to the fund. And then just one, there's a third funding window, which to me is probably the most illustrative of why we need to include this kind of trust building relationship and this kind of new funding models into feminist foreign policy and as a way of operationalizing WPS implementation. And that's through the third funding window, which supports women human rights defenders. So in 2022, we opened up this new window, and since then we have supported 214 women to participate in peace negotiations, and we prioritize participation in track 1 processes, because as we know, women are overrepresented in track 2 and track 3, which are, as you said, not, it's like, oh, it's women can talk with civil society on the side, whereas men are going to be in the track 1 and talk real business about, security and conflict. But those 214 women who were supported also included 553 dependents. So not only does the fund directly give money to women human rights defenders to lead and participate, but they also support their families, their dependents, and what does that say? It says that when you directly support women, you support communities. When you directly support women-led organizations, you support democracies. When you directly support women-led civil society, you support conflict prevention, you support peace building, and you create stronger, healthier societies. That's the bottom line. So, in closing, I just want to say that from the WRC's perspective, again, closing the gaps in protection, because the purpose of protection is to promote participation, right? So without protection, you can't have participation, and looking at those two and how they come together is, I think, where we need to pool our collective efforts. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, thank you for taking us where things are happening with, people's lived experiences and how each and every decision, each and every tool, and each and every decision around funding affects women and girls in their real lives. Thank you so much. In closing, I just wanted to say, when I was preparing the run-off show for this event, it was beautiful. It was in the by the minute, and it was 3 rounds of questions, and of course none of this matter right now. So you've covered everything that we had agreed to cover, except without the beautiful organization that I had put. But thank you ever so much. Aruna, Åsa, Alicia, Lopa, and Rahel, and also the minister. And I think we can see the different perspectives and the different entry points, and certainly what we can say is that this is the part of this long-term process of having these uncomfortable conversations, which we need to continue. So this is not, of course, so what you will be receiving from us, from our colleagues at the New York office, is the recording of the conversation.
Very good.
But with our partners with whom we're working on this, I think this is part of what we will be doing next. I mean, we will be moving to next steps in terms of pushing the conversation forward, but also practically, what does it mean? So thank you all very much. We can continue the discussion over our luncheon that our colleagues and friends at the New York office are offering. It's this way? It's this way.
Yeah.
Okay, so please join us for lunch, and thank you ever so much. This was awesome.
Yes,
Very good.